Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom, Episode 10. I must begin this episode by paying my respects and tribute to the late American visionary, international political organizer, and presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away earlier this week on the 12th of February 2019 at the age of 96. Today, my guest, Mike Billington, has been a close associate of Mr. LaRouche for many years. Mike is a leading figure in the LaRouche movement, Asia editor for the Executive Intelligence Review, and author of Reflections of an American Political Prisoner, the Repression and Promise of the LaRouche Movement. Billington graduated from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut in 1967. He then joined the Peace Corps, where he taught mathematics and music, first in Guyana and then Thailand. Upon returning to the U.S., he joined the LaRouche movement in 1972, in the early stages of the movement's history. Along with LaRouche and other close associates, Billington was later prosecuted by Robert Mueller in the 1980s, serving a prison sentence from 1989 to 2000 in what is well argued to be a move of political repression. There are notable parallels with Mueller's prosecution of Donald Trump and his associates today. Today, we will explore these topics in what is sure to be a fascinating conversation. Welcome, Mike.
Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. It's great to have you here. But, under sad circumstances, I'd like to start off by inviting you to say a few words in tribute to Lyndon LaRouche and his life, what it meant to you, and his continued significance for the world today.
Lyndon LaRouche is one of the very few true genius characters in modern history. And like Socrates, and like Christ for that matter, anyone who has a vision and a capacity to identify what can and must be done by humanity to create a better future. He was castigated, denounced, assassination attempts, and as you mentioned, the incarceration of LaRouche, which was, in a sense, we called it the third trial of Socrates. He was somebody who he was an economist who mastered the work. He was most influenced in his youth by Gottfried Leibniz, the great physicist, scientist, philosopher, diplomat of the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, and whose influence really was the key influence on the founding fathers of the United States. And then later discovered the work of Nicholas of Cusa, who was probably the key figure in launching the European Christian Renaissance. And these figures gave rise to he and his wife Helga Zepp LaRouche, whom you know, who is now and has been for a couple of years pretty much running the organization, and will certainly with Lynn's death, introduced to the work of Friedrich Schiller, the poet of freedom, as he was known, the German poet who most people don't know was the poet of the American Revolution, that America was built on the ideas of Leibniz and of Schiller. There are Schiller statues all over the United States. This has been lost, in today. But we then built the International Schiller Institute, committed to the idea of, we once said, one fist over two continents, meaning the American continents, both North and South, and the Eurasian continent. We didn't mean to leave out South America, but in fact it was that theme, the idea that the Schiller Institute had to fight to create the conditions, economic, political, and social, necessary to prevent the descent into global war, which has been intense over these last 30 years, and that the only way that could be done is to wage a true renaissance in which we address the way people think and how people think, not just what they think, but to address the question of why people become dumbed down by political and economic circumstances, but that in moments of great crisis, which Mr. LaRouche knew was coming because he understood how the American financial system after the death of Roosevelt had been systematically, and especially after the assassination of Kennedy, had been systematically taken over by the British system, wiping out the American Hamiltonian system of national banking, of directed credit, and replaced with British-style so-called free market, free trade, i.e. no regulations, allow the banking interest to control your economy rather than the elected government. And that this was leading to a bubble, which LaRouche had long forecast in several very accurate forecasts, would lead to a general breakdown crisis of the world financial system. So based on that concept, he knew that we were coming to a crisis in which people would be forced by circumstances to put aside their false axioms, their assumptions that somehow they will take care of us. And that in those moments, people would be capable of understanding far more profound concepts about man, about science, about the nature of the physical economy. And at that moment, we, and LaRouche said, at that moment, we must be prepared to lead not just a political revolution, but a global Renaissance revolution to rebuild the American system, but to build a world based on the idea that there are common aims to mankind, and to refute the British ideology of so-called geopolitics, which is based on the idea that there are those born to rule and those born to serve, master and slave, that man is inherently an animal whose animal instincts will necessarily force him into conflict with his fellow man, and to refute that aristocratic imperial ideology about the nature of man with one which locates the creative power of the human mind, which exists in every human being, as the basis upon which we could and must build a true new paradigm for mankind. This is the genius of Lyndon LaRouche.
Yeah, I mean, that whole explanation there was extremely broad and deep, and for a lot of people, though a lot of the concepts would have heard it for the first time. They might, and it's really an entirely different paradigm, a way of looking at the world that requires huge shifts, and I know that's what your movement has been working on for decades. And I'd like to approach those things to sort of unpack them one by one, I guess, through your own story, so we can tackle some of the huge topics and ideas that you just mentioned just now. So if we start off with yourself, so let's start off with the Peace Corps. Can you describe, your work with the Peace Corps and how you got started in it?
Well, partially I joined the Peace Corps because this was 1967. I would have been sent to Vietnam if I didn't have, they even wouldn't allow graduate school as an exception to going to Vietnam.
And how old were you at the time?
In
21?
22, yeah.
22, mm-hmm. Right.
And they had a lottery for the draft. I was very high up. I think I had number 6. I would have been drafted. I would have been sent to Vietnam. So I had very few choices, but I had wanted to join the Peace Corps anyway. I had been quite inspired by John Kennedy's presidency and his commitment to the idea that we as a nation should do something better than send our military forces all over the world and fight wars.
Were you ideologically opposed to the Vietnam War at the time, or was it you just did not want to serve, or what was the...
I was very, very much opposed to the Vietnam War. I wasn't anti-war, but this was a horrible colonial war. This was the end of the United States, by the way. People should recognize that the assassination of Kennedy, who would not have gone to war in Vietnam, he had made that clear, that in his second term, he intended to pull out, to establish relations with China, and that he was, although he had sent many so-called advisors and CIA-type operatives into Laos and Cambodia, and he was being pulled in, like he was in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, was being pulled into a war. But he agreed with Diem that America must not send its military forces in and repeat the horrible French colonial warfare against Vietnam after the war. And that's why they killed him. And in fact, they killed Diem, as you know, just a few days before they killed Kennedy. And this was the British. The British killed Kennedy. We have documented that in great, great detail because they wanted the U.S. to be the dumb giant carrying out the British imperial policy of divide and conquer, colonial warfare, colonial domination through the IMF and the World Bank, if not through direct occupation. And that Kennedy wasn't going to do it, so they killed him.
And the British system, just to clarify, as you said earlier, is a system in which finance capital ruled over national development. Right? I mean, a lot of people don't understand what British imperialism was, and it was more development of the ports and international trade in all the colonies, as opposed to developing the interior, which was the American system. Correct?
Our book, you know about it. Your audience. Do I have a copy here? No, I don't. We published a book called "The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge." Mm-hmm. After Xi Jinping announced the New Silk Road program. But in that, we have a beautiful map, a map with Africa, two maps of Africa next to each other. The first are all the railroads that the colonial powers built in Africa. And they look like knives going into the continent, from the port to the mine, to the port to the mine. You couldn't get from one country to another. You couldn't get across the continent. It was only to exploit the raw materials and use the cheap labor, slave labor, really.
Exactly like in the Caribbean, all the routes goes right to Miami or London, and to get to Antigua or to get to a neighboring island is so difficult. Yeah.
And then next to that, we have the map of what's being done now, primarily by the Chinese, but not only the Chinese, Japanese, even the Germans are building things. But it's a map that shows the total connectivity of the African continent, getting from every high-speed rail connecting every capital of the African continent. This is what led to this tremendous conference in Beijing last year, when almost every leader of Africa went to Beijing for their conference with China, and the optimism that they felt. They saw how China had lifted 700 million people out of poverty through infrastructure, because they understood that it was infrastructure which was the roadblock to real development into being a modern industrial nation. That, of course, is what the IMF and the World Bank would not do. They said, we'll leave infrastructure to the private sector, which means no infrastructure. Keep you backwards so that we can continue exploiting your raw materials, give you a little bit to keep your small farmers alive, help them get their product to market, but don't build the infrastructure which lifts the entire platform of production and lifts everybody's creative potential. So that's the character of imperial power versus what China is doing and what Roosevelt wanted to do after the war. What Roosevelt wanted to do, and he'd said so in building up what became actually the Bretton Woods system, was to have the IMF, World Bank, take the tremendous productive power built by Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s, which made it possible for us to win the war against fascism and Japanese nationalism. Militarism, rather. But to take this productive boom to the rest of the world. He had gone to the colonies. He'd seen how the British and the French had left their colonies in the same condition they were 200 years ago. And it disgusted him. And he told Winston Churchill, we're not fighting this war to save the damn British Empire.
Well, obviously, I mean, you've been working on this for a very long time. When you were a young man, going to the Peace Corps, had you been this
I ran into this.
Developed?
I ran into this directly in Guyana. You know the history of Guyana.
Yeah.
When I was told, when I applied for the Peace Corps and they told me to Guyana, I said, where the hell is that? I had to go to the library to find out where I was being sent. It was a new name. That's part of the reason. I guess I would have
British Guyana. Yeah.
British Guyana. But anyway, when I got there, I realized that, like all British operations, when they grant independence, they first divide it into warring factions. Right. Creating Pakistan versus India, divide and conquer is the basis for this. So what had been done in Guyana, you know very well, is they divided the black population from the Indian population. They stirred up bloody race riots. What had been generally integrated villages all over the country turned into either all black or all Indian.
Yeah.
Indian like yourself from India, not native Indians.
Correct.
Although there were native Indians in Guyana as well. So this was what I arrived in, not really knowing much about the British Empire, but I got this firsthand experience.
Yeah.
And that's the way I spent my time there, which I was in a distant village, which was less segregated than most of the country up in the Essequibo area in Anna Regina. But I worked there to try created a coffee club and various sports things to try to bring the Indian and black populations together. But it was...
what was the name of the village you worked in?
Anna Regina.
Okay,
it's on the Essequibo coast.
Okay.
It's on the part up towards Venezuela.
You're right. Which
was the least populated. But anyway, very, very interesting experience. Something that was a mind-opening experience for me, not just the Peace Corps experience, but experiencing the effect of the British Empire. And we became very close friends many years later with Fred Wills. Do you know Fred Wills?
Not personally, but I know of him, yeah.
Well, Fred was the foreign minister. He was best known because he was the broadcaster for the cricket matches. But he was a foreign minister who ran afoul of the British Empire. He'd been educated there. And he often would say he was cheating the British Empire because the life expectancy of people in British colonies was 46. So every year he lived past that, he was cheating the British Empire. But Fred was another amazing figure, a Shakespeare scholar, a politician who worked with Mr. LaRouche for years and years. And then when he was finally sent, in a certain sense, in exile, came to New York and worked with us directly for many, many years.
What year was that?
What year did he come to New York? I don't recall, but what year he arrived. But he was there through the 80s, maybe
right.
even.
He fell out with Forbes Burnham, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because at that time, the murder of Walter Rodney.
Yeah, but it wasn't internal.
Okay.
Fred went to the Colombo meeting of the IMF. It might have been an IMF conference in Colombo, and made a call for a global debt moratorium, which came from Lyndon LaRouche, and located the fact that we were heading into a debt bubble globally in which the debt bomb, a term Lynn LaRouche had created, that debt bomb was ready to explode. And he said, we must call for a new global monetary system, financial system, based upon development, not upon British.
Is that where the call for the new international economic order was first made?
I don't know if it was the first, but it was the first in that circumstance at the pinnacle of the power of the of British Empire.
And it was Fred Wills who was the first government representative to table the idea of the new international economic order. Am I correct?
It was a moratorium on the global debt and a new economic order. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I then became very close to Fred when he was in the U.S. I only knew him by name in Guyana, but I think there's a continuity between that experience I had and then becoming a close friend of Fred Wills. So then I went off to Thailand and got a different experience. This was 1969 to 71, the peak of the Vietnam War. Yeah. So here I was in generally a beautiful country of good, people who were well developed for the third world relative to standards in the developing sector. They'd never been colonized, not officially, although they claim IMF, World Bank control over their economy and so forth. But here I was in the middle of a country which was in a sense occupied by the U.S. military. They had military bases all over Thailand, which were the air and sea bases for the war against Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And I had the horror of experiencing that, going to these air bases, watching the Phantom jets, reading about what was happening to Vietnam, but seeing what was happening to Indochina which was not that different from the rural communities in Thailand, and just seeing how they were being napalmed, mass murdered, destroyed. So this obviously also had a huge, huge impact on me. So I came back to the United States with an inherent sense of the evil of the British Empire and an inherent sense of how evil America had become in terms of its foreign policy. Later to learn through...
Did you articulate it as British? Because most people would articulate it as American imperialism.
Exactly. This is the line, that America is the new imperial power, the British Empire sunk into the sea, and so forth. That misses the point. It's not the British people, it's not even the British country, but it's the British Empire, located in the City of London and in Wall Street, as a global financial empire. Remember, even the British East Indies Company was a private company.
That's right.
By the Baring Bank and by what became then Standard and Chartered and the South.
That's right. Nehru's autobiography points to the financial nature of British imperialism. It was not primarily a military, it was very much financial that we don't recognize. It was not primarily political. It was.
And by and large, the banks, which ran the British East Indies Company, ran the governments. Not completely, not always, but the royalty and the British banking control over government policy was what America fought its revolution against. It was this idea that this financial empire had power over governments that the American founding fathers, Hamilton and others, understood at that time. And if you read the Federalist Papers that they wrote, you'll see they understood what the core of the evil in the British Empire was.
The Boston Tea Party was, again, where was the tea coming from? It's the East India Company, and it was a revolt against the company. But here's one thing strange. Now, this is a little bit off, but I want to ask you if you've looked into this. The flag of the United States of America is almost exactly the flag of the East India Company.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, you that's something that you check out the flag of the East. It's 13 stripes.
I wouldn't read anything into that, though.
Yeah, it's 13 stripes within the corner, but there's a Union Jack in the corner. But in the American flag, it then became the 13 stars. So I was always very curious about that because I don't know what the explanation.
I think the American founding fathers did not despise their European roots. Mm-hmm. They understood that America was this city on the hill, that it was those in Europe who had been influenced by the Renaissance, who, the creation of the nation state, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. These ideas were noble ideas that gave birth to the modern world and to sovereign nation states. The idea that a nation was sovereign, that the king was not sovereign, but the people were sovereign.
Yeah.
And that your policy had to be the interest of the other. The basis on which the 30 Years' War was ended in the Peace of Westphalia was on this concept of the nation state, which inherently had the concept that your interests as a nation had to include the interests of the others. So it was sovereign nation states working together for the common good. Mm-hmm. But you had to have a nation state rather than a king who was sovereign to establish that capacity.
And obviously respecting the sovereignty of other nation states.
Exactly. Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. And that's what's been taken down, is that idea of sovereignty has been taken down. And this, of course, leads directly to Donald Trump, who is an unusual fellow and makes some people not like his way and so forth. But if you haven't watched his speech to the UN at the last September UN, I strongly encourage you and your listeners to listen to that speech. It's an incredibly powerful speech.
I think so. I totally agree. It's
clearly, and he's fighting for sovereignty. He says, when I say make America great again, what I mean is that we have to look to our sovereignty, make our nation great, just like India must make India great. And he talked about the immigration problem, the problem of people who are swarming out of Central and South America and the Caribbean because of poverty, because of the drug gangs, because of the breakdown of society. not just that they want to come to America, they try to escape this horror. And he said, how do we solve this immigration problem? We make the Central American countries great again.
Exactly.
We have to build their sovereign capacity to create economies in which people will be employed, can contribute to their development. And Trump is now working with AMLO, with Lopez Obrador in Mexico, the new president there, on that idea. He's made a sort of a down payment of, I think it's $20 billion to build El Salvador and Guatemala and so forth, and southern Mexico, to build up this area economically, which is, in the long run, it's the only solution to this.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a famous video by, I think, Numbers USA, talking about, this misguided idea that having open borders is going to solve poverty or whatever in the world. That what you need to do is have development throughout the world, in every country of the world. That's what we need. Not to keep them poor and have people run away.
I don't disagree with Trump's effort to hermetically seal that border, because, as you know, we are experiencing the worst drug epidemic in the history of the human race, perhaps even worse than the opium wars in China. I mean, there's not a family in America who doesn't have someone in their family who's been destroyed or perhaps even killed by drugs. There's not a community, not even a small rural community in the rural states like Nebraska or something. Every community has been torn apart by this horrible drug epidemic under presidents, especially Obama, who were legalizing it, who were legalizing something not only illegal but immoral, the destruction of the human mind of our citizens. So it's the border wall is not going to end that, but we have to have a hermetically sealed border in conjunction with a development policy for Mexico and for Central America, which can end the power of the drug lords, who by and large run these countries. You probably know. I mean, they have presidents, and some of them are committed. A lot of them are turning to China now, because for the first time they're getting an offer from China to actually build their infrastructure, their economy, which, as we discussed already, the West stopped doing. We don't build infrastructure, this stupid policy. But, nonetheless, the U.S. can and must play a role if this is going to be successful, which is why our focus as an organization has been America must join the new Silk Road. We have to join with China and with Russia and with India, what LaRouche called the four powers. His concept of how to deal with this financial blowout in the West. When we had the big 2008 crisis, you remember, when the financial system nearly completely exploded under the weight of this massive derivative bubble, this bad gambling debts bubble that was being fed by Bush and by Obama, just printing money to keep the bubble afloat rather than putting it out of its misery and start issuing credit for real development. That didn't happen, so now it's worse today than it was before the crash in 2008. But at that time, and this is important, LaRouche said, okay, my plan for rebuilding America to restore the Roosevelt policies like Glass-Steagall. People may not know that, but Glass-Steagall was sort of the bedrock of Roosevelt's policy to end the Depression by dividing the speculative banks from the commercial banks. And the speculative banks like, Merrill Lynch and Goldman Sachs were allowed to gamble, but they got no government backup. And the commercial banks,
they weren't allowed to gamble with people's retirement savings and
only rich people who wanted them to speculate with their money.
That's right.
Deposits could only be taken by the commercial banks, which were strictly regulated by the government. If they got in trouble, the FDIC, the Federal Direct FDIC, I forget, but the FDIC would be there to help them.
Insurance Corporation, I think.
Yeah. But they were not allowed to speculate in any way. No stocks and bonds, no derivatives. Only take in deposits and lend into the real economy, housing, infrastructure, schools and hospitals, and so forth, industry, agriculture. So this was a system that worked under Roosevelt. That's what got us out of the Depression. It made it possible to win the war against fascism, and it basically fed the development through the 50s and 60s until it Kennedy was killed, the war, and these Roosevelt policies began to be taken down.
The building of the highway systems, the dams, all these.
All of that stuff happened under the New Deal ideas.
Yeah.
But what LaRouche said after the 2008 crisis is that this won't work now. My policy of restoring these policies won't work because this thing is too far gone. There is no solution outside of ending the British Empire altogether, which must and can only be done by the minimum alliance between Russia, China, India, and the United States, what he called the four powers. These represented the great cultures of Europe and Asia. In a sense, the US represented the highest culture of Europe, which had to go to the US to get away from the kingdoms and the British imperial policies.
The Enlightenment ideals of Europe, yeah.
So this idea of the four powers, if you think about it, this is what Trump is fighting for. He repeatedly says, I want to be friends with Russia. It's a good thing to be friends with Russia. And the British, of course, and the MI6, Christopher Steele, the people who are running this fake Russiagate garbage with Robert Mueller, their hitman, like he was against us, against LaRouche. It was Mueller who set up the Get LaRouche task force in the 1980s in order to bring us down, to put LaRouche in prison and to try to break the organization, which they failed to do, but they managed to damage us, no question. And the same people now are representing the British imperial effort to stop Trump from adopting ideas that were put in motion by Lyndon LaRouche over these last 50 years.
Let's work our way to that, because it's very important. So how did you actually get involved with the LaRouche movement when you returned to the United States? I suppose your stint was over with the Peace Corps, was it?
Yeah, I finished the Peace Corps. I was 26, so I couldn't be drafted.
Right.
And I'll admit that's why I probably would have stayed in Thailand. But I was 26, and therefore I could come back and live as a free man without getting sucked into this horrible war. And the war was still raging. This is 1971. This is the Nixon time.
Yeah.
So, I came back, and basically I started getting involved in the anti-war movements.
Right.
I went to some of the marches on the Pentagon.
And you were where? New York? You were you're
living in Berkeley, actually. My brother had been living in
Berkeley,
which was the headquarters for the rock and roll.
Right. I think SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, was out there.
That was actually formed in New York.
Oh, that was New York.
And LaRouche's organization came about as a counter within SDS, a faction within SDS, Students for Democratic Society. LaRouche intervened on that and formed something called the SDS Labor Committees, which said that the anti-war movement, which you may know was largely run by the Ford Foundation and institutions who were purposely creating this sort of gang, counter-gang, pro-war, anti-war, and kept the left focused on almost anarchist type of ideas. So LaRouche's view was, look, I agree this is a horrible war, but it's not anti-war per se that we need to fight for. It's that we as a nation have failed to carry out the policy of taking our development process to these countries. Instead, we've fallen for this British trick of colonial power, using the boogeyman of communism to go in and destroy countries and take them over. We have to build these nations. So this was a direct counter position, and we have to support the rebuilding of American industry in America.
Even the Monroe Doctrine, which is being used to, about Venezuela right now and throughout the 80s with El Salvador, Nicaragua, etc. It was misinterpreted because the Monroe Doctrine was an anti-colonial doctrine to keep the European powers out from undermining the independent republics. But then all of a sudden it became, some American imperial ideology, which it was actually, it was an anti-imperial ideology. Yeah.
So, that's how our organization came about. Originally from the SDS Labor Committee, it became the National Caucus of Labor Committees, and ultimately we started the EIR magazine and the Schiller Institute and so forth. So I was in California. I was looking at all the different political organizations, some of the socialist organizations and other things, working in a Maoist bookstore. But then I discovered LaRouche's writings.
Right. Were you close to the Black Panthers or something? I know they were also, strong Maoists.
Knew a number of them, in later years as well, people who had been in the Panthers that became friends. But by and large, it was, again, just discovering here's LaRouche intervening and saying, the question here is the economy. The economy is going to blow apart. We're being sucked into British colonial style wars. It's going to destroy our economy. It's going to destroy our people through the way they think, accepting this kind of evil that we fought our revolution against. And then I basically broke from all of this sort of left swamp, the rock, drug, sex, countercultural stuff dominating the left at the time, and joined with LaRouche. So that was 1971, 72. I've been working with him, for close to 50 years now. Right.
I mean, I suppose that's why I think the LaRouche movement gets smeared as a fascist movement by critics because it's stand against the counterculture and stand against the sex, drugs, rock and roll, and so they say that's some sort of fascist authoritarian thing.
I read through the obituaries that were published by the mainstream press this morning, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and several others, AP. They're all the same. Different people wrote them because they're not exactly the same words, but somebody carefully coordinated. Back in the 1970s, the Washington Post has a famous editorial which said, we must never, the media of our nation must not mention the name Lyndon LaRouche except to slander him. And the word went out, and that became the policy. And this reflected the same thing, carefully coordinated. They all had the same thing to say. He was a leftist who went to the far right. Well, he's not left or right. This is just nonsense.
That's right.
That he's anti-Semitic because we criticized Israel. That's what's going on to Corbyn in England right now. He's an anti-Semite because he dares to criticize Netanyahu and these neo-Nazis.
That's right.
So,
and now even criticism of the banking system is being portrayed as anti-Semitic.
The guy who wrote the definitive book on Lyndon LaRouche, called Lyndon LaRouche and the New Left and Fascism or something like that, said that when LaRouche attacks the British, he really means the Jews.
Yeah.
Half our membership is Jewish. And so that whole idea is it's just part of this attempt to keep the population. It's what Bertrand Russell used to say. If we can, through education and through the media, if we can convince people that snow is black, then we win.
I'll tell you how I got involved, I guess, if you want to put it that way, or even aware of the LaRouche movement, because I was actually writing a paper about about Plato's Republic, and the campaigner had an excellent, very different point of view of Plato and the Republic, and placed it in the context of the wars at the time and Plato's work as a general in those wars and so forth. I was looking at things like Alan Bloom and his sort of unique interpretation of the Republic, and looking at these things, and then I looked at the other articles in the campaigner and started to look at all these things, and it was amazing that I'm very much someone who is interested and involved in all these kind of I guess you can say fringe movements. I'm very interested in them, and I had never heard of LaRouche. And I'm talking about, I was doing this research maybe around 2010 or something. So through all this time, I'd never heard of the movement, and you all had done so much, had written so much, and I was just amazed. I mean, the internet is such an incredible resource because of that, because all of these hidden and suppressed movements and ideas can be found, even though now they're really trying to clamp down on the internet. But
this gets into my work in prison.
Right.
LaRouche's view was that all of the so-called divisions that the British Empire uses to keep the world divided: ethnic divisions, racial divisions, fights over territory, anything to divide and conquer. It's the classic, imperial design. That Lynn's view was that there's no such thing as left and right. If you're talking about communism and socialism, you're basically talking nonsense, because people have totally different views of what each of those things are. But that the key divisions in the world, which are common in all cultures, is this division between what in the Western culture is Platonic versus Aristotelian ideology, which is what you obviously were studying. Simply said, the view of Plato was that it's the creative power of the human mind connected to the universal laws of the universe, that there is truth, there is universal lawfulness to the universe. Man is unique and in the image of God because he is capable of discovering those laws and applying them to changing the human environment rather than being subject to biological change or something. And then Aristotle, who said, no man is born either a master or a slave. The mind is a blank slate. All we know is sense perception. There's no such thing as creativity. If your sense perception doesn't cohere with the truth, you're stuck, because you can't get beyond Aristotelian logic, beyond a computer type of thinking, and actually creatively solve a problem like every great scientist has, when our knowledge doesn't cohere with what we discover about what's going on, and we have to come up with a higher hypothesis. What Plato called the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis is that idea that man is capable of hypothesizing about the way advancing hypothesis give man more power over nature.
And the conviction that the world of the ideas and forms is actually the real world, in a sense, and that we are an imperfect reflection of that, and we are striving towards the world of the forms, because we're
the basis of a new paradigm which actually recognizes the truth about man. It's not just you have a different opinion, but the truth about man is that we have the creative power, unlike any animal, to see the future and to create that future through the discovery of the laws of the universe and applying them. What you see in the so-called Green New Deal and all this insane environmentalist stuff is basically saying, no, we cannot advance humankind. We cannot discover new principles of the universe. We have to go back. And ultimately that means reducing the world's population by down to 1 billion or so, which, is the genocide behind this so-called green policy. But let me say, because we may not have a whole lot of time, just briefly, what I did in my 10 years in prison was that I took this concept of the Platonic versus the Aristotelian. And Nicholas of Cusa, whom I mentioned is sort of the key founder of the Renaissance, had actually done a dialogue called In the Peace of the Faith, in which he had a dialogue between Christian, Jew, Muslim, Tartar, and others, and basically located the fact that the Christian idea of the Trinity, of a creator, the created, and the process of creation, which in the Trinity, in the Christian view, is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or love. Mm-hmm. But that he located that this doesn't necessarily have to be looked only in the Christian view, but that this idea of a lawfulness to the universe, of a creator, whatever your concept of what God is, a creator, meaning that there is lawfulness to the universe and its self-development, leading to man and man's ability to participate in that self-development, and the created, and the act of creation being that which unites the Father and the Son, or the creator and the created. It's this process of creativity or love. So Cusa didn't know China. Yeah. He didn't know Confucianism. So I had 10 years, I got a 77-year sentence. So I had 77 years ahead of me. And I said, well, I might as well study China, because there's a lot of history in China. So I became something of an Asia scholar, but in particular studying Confucianism and comparing, looking for within Chinese philosophy, that division between the Platonic and the Aristotelian, between the idea of man as a creative power in Imago Viva Dei, with Christ being Imago Viva Dei with God, but to see that within a Confucian culture. And I won't try to describe it now, that would take hours, but I wrote extensively, and any of your viewers who might want to read it, I wrote a number of very long studies comparing the Christian Renaissance, the European Renaissance, with the Confucian Renaissance, which is not just the Confucius and Mencius writings, which compare very much with Plato and Aristotle, against the Taoists and the Aristotelian thinking in China. But especially in the Sung dynasty in the 12th century, the genius of Zhu Xi, people don't know his name, but this was like Nicholas of Cusa, a genius who gave rise to a tremendous renaissance in China in the Sung dynasty. So this was my work. I
mean, I really want to get to that because it's fascinating, you know. I mean, but let's start. I mean, how did the prosecution against the movement begin? You know, what triggered it? Like, was Mueller there at the beginning, or did he come in later? Or
it began with LaRouche's connection to Reagan. During the 1980 campaign, LaRouche got to know Reagan in the primary up in New Hampshire. You've probably heard the name Roger Stone, this guy who is now being persecuted by Miller. Roger Stone got to know LaRouche during that 1980 campaign and became convinced over the years that LaRouche was the greatest genius of the era, and helped take his ideas to Reagan and then later to Nixon and then also to Trump. Took LaRouche's ideas, and he spoke at a number of our conferences. That's why Miller's going after him now. But in that 1980 campaign, he got to know LaRouche, he got to know Reagan, I mean, and he conveyed to him his idea that we had to end the fundamental British division of the world, which was the East versus the West, and that the so-called MAD policy, mutual assured destruction, which was supposedly guaranteeing peace in the world by having America and Russia agree that we should keep a certain amount of nuclear weapons capable of blowing each other up, and that this will stop us from going to war because we know we could blow each other up. Well, this was, okay, fine and good. You're not going to have a global nuclear war, maybe. But the point was that kept the world divided. This was a fundamental division of the world, which also allowed surrogate wars in the developing sector, colonial surrogate wars in Vietnam, for instance, where they were essentially wars between.
And the amazing thing is how it is being reproduced today, a division between East and West, with no ideological basis. Before they could say communism and socialism. Now they can't even say why. You're just supposed to. They interfered in the election, so we hate Russia. Or something.
They bought $5,000 worth of Facebook ads, and that changed the world.
Exactly. They can't even say why, but we have to fight a war in Venezuela and where in the South China Sea, because Russia's evil. So it even goes to show that even during the Cold War, the thing probably was fraudulent.
This is, the fact that they succeeded in throwing LaRouche in prison in 1989 is not just a misjustice to us. You probably know that Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, said this is the worst case of government misconduct in the history of this nation.
Now, but let me ask you. So,
because the idea behind LaRouche's proposal for what became known as the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, was that the U.S. and Russia's scientific and military communities worked together to develop a space-based defense against missiles that could stop a rogue nation or even stop each other if something accidental kicked off. But by and large, it would bring our countries together around pursuing the frontiers of human knowledge, scientific knowledge, beam technology, laser technology, and new technologies we didn't even know, in a way to circumvent the entire British Empire. And when LaRouche convinced Reagan to adopt that policy, which he did on March 31st of 1983, if I have the date right, when he announced that policy, that was the spark. Kissinger and the British crowd said, LaRouche has got to go. And they began slandering LaRouche. They began writing articles about how horrible it was that Reagan was listening to this madman, this racist anti-Semite, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff got started precisely because LaRouche was getting to leaders who had a moral compass, And Reagan did. Reagan wasn't the most brilliant guy, but he had a moral compass, and he wanted to bring the US and Russia together, which is why they tried to kill him and why they went after LaRouche, which is the same reason they're going after Trump today, to prevent the circumvention.
Was Mueller close to Kissinger or something? I mean, what is his importance or role?
He was the U.S. attorney in Boston, and he was a trusted agent of the corrupt FBI, DOJ. This was J. Edgar Hoover time, you know.
Okay.
You still have the same horrible corruption within the FBI and the DOJ, coming from the British, direct ties into MI6.
So Mueller actually worked with J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI?
Well, he was at the time a U.S. attorney.
Right.
For the DOJ, later became head of the FBI, you know, took J. Edgar Hoover's spot. And as you probably know, in that document we put out about who Robert Mueller is, he ran the Get LaRouche task force. He was made head of the FBI just before 9/11.
Was it called the Get LaRouche task force?
Yeah.
That was the name, okay.
Oh, yeah. When we were raided on October 6, 1986, by 400 armed men from all the different agencies, it was DEA, FBI, CIA, they were all there with armored personnel carriers, helicopters, all armed to the teeth as if we were a terrorist group or something, you know, just like what happened to Roger Stone. You know,
yeah.
On a smaller scale.
Well, what was the justification for mobilizing? What did they say to the press? I mean, what were they saying? Yeah, you guys were hiding arms and.
If you read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post today with their obituaries, they say LaRouche lives in a heavily armed camp and runs a dangerous cult, which is connected to, you know, it depends on who they're talking to. He's either a fascist or a communist, you know, one of the two, or something, or a racist or an anti-Semite, all of which
kind of like with the Branch Davidians, I guess, when they just
tried to justify that kind of an attack. Exactly.
Yeah.
What happened that morning? I was arrested that morning. They had swarmed around my house with their Uzis and, you know, and so forth. I won't go into the details, but they also completely encircled the compound where Lynn lived and had the helicopters and the Army personnel carriers and intended to raid and start a shootout and kill him. And LaRouche wrote to Reagan and said, I am about to be killed by a illegal criminal raid. And if I am killed, my blood is going to be in your hands, Mr. President. Stop it. And within hours, the whole thing pulled back. And his lawyer was called and asked to turn himself in, which he did. So this was an assassination attempt, just like you say, a Branch Davidian type scenario, which LaRouche was able to circumvent because he was able to get to Reagan.
Right. Now, can you explain the campaign to exonerate LaRouche from these charges right now?
Well, it's what I was saying before. The point here is that this is not only an injustice, as Ramsey Clark said, the worst case of government misconduct in American history, but it was a blow to the American people. You think about the situation we're in today, not the American people, the human race. Think about the situation we're in today, on the brink of war with Russia. Despite Trump wanting to be friends with Russia, we're on the brink of war with Russia because he's surrounded by these neoconservative lunatics who had no choice. He has nobody he can call on except us, and he can't bring us into the government for reasons he believes. But in any case, had LaRouche actually been allowed to continue expanding, we were winning elections around the country and so forth, and had the kind of influence on Reagan and others, then we would not have had this drug epidemic, because we launched the National Anti-Drug Coalition in the 1980s. We coined the word war on drugs. Nobody had used that word before. Yeah. But we meant it.
What I want to point out that's really interesting is that, I mean, you guys identified yourself very often on the left with the labor unions. You were sort of affiliated with the Democratic Party. But then also, you know, you worked with Reagan, who was a Republican, with Trump, who was a Republican. So really the party lines kind of are sort of meaningless for you.
Yeah, Lynn has long said that the two-party system, two-potty system, he calls it, you know, is an abomination. People are basically told they're participating in the democratic system by going out to vote. And you're voting either, like in the Gore-Bush campaign in 2000, then said, who are you going to vote for, AIDS or cancer? Which do you prefer? You know, this is the two-party system.
Yeah.
And, you know, how do you get an abomination like Obama? I mean, Obama is a warmongering lunatic who was given the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize.
Before he did anything.
Advocate of legalizing drugs, carried out a genocide against the Libyan nation, turning it over to warring terrorist factions, participating as Bush did in this horrible Iraq war under Cheney. All of these horrors that have beset the world, destroying the Middle East, creating this mass drug culture that controls much of South America and Central America. This could have been avoided. So the world lost an advocate of reason, of sanity, right? Somebody who was beginning to successfully organize a movement which could have prevented the disaster he forecast and which has now come about. And we have this opportunity because of this very unusual fellow, Donald Trump. He doesn't know how to do what he says he wants to do, but he wants to do the right things. He wants to be friends with Russia. He wants to be friends with China. He wants to end these colonial wars. He wants to pull out of Syria. You saw what happened when he said, I want to pull out of Syria. Republicans, Democrats, no, we must have war. Yeah. I mean, this really reveals that we're living in a McCarthyite period.
That's right.
McCarthy pale by significance.
That's right. Absolutely.
As you said, there's no communism out there. You know, this is pure, unmitigated British imperial colonial policy. Yeah, and Trump is up against it. He's not really a Republican. He's had to use the Republican Party to counter complete deterioration.
He defeated the Republicans decisively.
Ran against all 17 of them and took over. And now they have to sort of go along with him. Although, as you know, there's still many people who hate him in the Republican leadership. That's right. Including in his cabinet. And as came out when he called for getting out of Afghanistan and Syria, McConnell passed a bill in the Congress denouncing the president for wanting to end these genocidal colonial wars. So, and they're trying to get him to go to war in Venezuela. I don't believe he's going to go in militarily. I think he's smart enough, and I think he knows he's being tracked in this thing. He's doing what he tends to do. Look at the Korea thing, which was phenomenal. Yeah. You know, very bold. We're going to fire in fury. We're going to blow you up if you dare do this and that. But as soon as Kim Jong-un said, okay, let's talk, he said, yeah, okay, let's talk.
Exactly.
And it was because he was working with Russia and with China, well as South Korea and Japan, that he was able to achieve this, what potentially is a tremendous victory against a British imperial division of the world, bringing all of Asia together. This North Korea pocket was the only sort of colonial remnant of the Cold War. And by bringing that to an end, it's not completely over, but he's just as far as he's brought it, he now has really brought all of Asia together around the idea of development, developing the Russian Far East, Japan investing with China, and the railroads connecting Korea to both Russia and China. This is a phenomenal development, which comes about because of Trump acting on LaRouche-type approach to this, and because China, with their Belt and Road, has really unleashed an unstoppable new paradigm, which could only be stopped by a global nuclear war at this point.
You know, I also want to focus a bit on you as well, because I think your story is so remarkable, and it's part of the movement. You know, like when I the little I've read about your time in prison, and you were sentenced to the longest sentence of all the LaRouche associates, 77 years. Just an incredible miscarriage of justice, injustice.
All the people I met in prison would say, 77 years, how many bodies do you have? How many did you kill, you know?
You know, I mean, and I read these things like how you trained yourself to sleep during the day so that you could study at night, because you didn't want to be disturbed by the daytime noise, you know. How you taught yourself to read and write Chinese, and you became knowledgeable about, you know, Chinese philosophy and history, and then this amazing thing which you did with your fellow LaRouche activist Paul Gallagher, who was also in the prison, founding a prisoners' chorus where prisoners sang classical choral music including the opera Fidelio by Beethoven. And you wrote your book at the time. I mean, this points to an entire, I mean...
This was a great moment. It's very emotional for me, actually, to think about it. But these were child molesters. I don't know. I was in a lower security prison at that time, and there probably weren't any mass murderers. I'd had many people around me who were mass murderers in the higher security prisons. But, these were people with serious crimes.
So you were mixed with like really bad people.
In the other prisons. Oh, yeah. I was in a high security prison most of the time.
Wow.
And they're not, most of them are not bad people,
Right. I mean, people who've committed bad crimes, let me say.
But anyway, at this prison, when Paul and I were together at this one prison, these were people who'd never sung any. There's one guy who was a good singer and also a musician, and one guy who had never sung before, but he played violin. But otherwise, these are just people from all over the world, African, South American, many Americans, about 18 or so altogether, who agreed when we said, okay, we'll teach you to sing. You've never sung? Okay, we'll teach you. And I had been trained by a great...
How did you even broach the idea?
Well, we have choruses as part of our work. We now have community choruses in New York and in Leesburg and Virginia.
But in the prison, how did you even start that conversation?
I just went around and, do you want to be in a chorus? I'll teach you to sing. And some of them were hard nuts and were hard to teach to sing. But, by the time, and we sang a Bach chorale, and we sang some Mozart, and we sang a Brahms piece. And other classical pieces. And as you mentioned, the high point was, if you know the opera Fidelio, Beethoven's only opera, there is a scene called The Prisoner's Chorus.
Right.
Absolutely beautiful men's choral piece. I won't describe the story, but it's when they come out of the prison for a moment and breathe the fresh air and think about freedom. So when I taught the smaller group, it's hard to sing. So I had a group that were somewhat better, and I taught the smaller group to sing that. And one of them, when we did our performance at a church meeting one time, they said, "Is it okay if we dress up like prisoners?" I said, "Yeah, okay, you can dress up like prisoners." But what I want to say is, I won't go through the details of this, but every one of the people in that chorus at some point or another came up to me personally and said, "I never knew there was this kind of beauty in the world, or that I could participate in that."
Yeah.
Excuse me.
No, I totally,
Very powerful, very powerful.
Yeah.
And it's this idea behind our community choruses now. There's thousands of people out there who will not respond to the politics or the economics of this. But if you can bring them in to participate in the creation of beauty, to spark that quality of the creative power of mind, which is the same process you have in discovering a great scientific principle, in composing a great classical piece of music, not something with drum beat. Classical culture.
This is what you're talking about, the human spirit and the dumbing down of the culture, and that when you can tap into what exists in every human being, the way that they can tap into the greater, and this goes to the idea of Plato and what we were talking about before, and that music is one of the greatest ways to do that. And when you get a high piece of music like Fidelio by Beethoven and singing about freedom and people, it just transforms you as a person, as a being, as an entity, and the whole universe is different, and your relationship to the universe is different. I that's how I understand.
You're absolutely right. And it's important that in our community choruses, we sing selections. We're in the process of singing Beethoven's Choral Fantasy, a beautiful piece with a brilliant pianist who's a Vietnamese American lady who is one of our leading organizers, but also a wonderful pianist. And but we also sing, in addition to these classical pieces, some of the spirituals, the Negro spirituals.
Yeah.
And as the people who studied with Dvorak when he came to the U.S. and studied with Burley and other Black singers, when he discovered these spirituals, he recognized that these spirituals coming out of slavery had the same quality as classical compositions.
Yeah.
And set about actually setting them to classical settings, as Dvorak did with his New World Symphony, which is using some of these Native American and Black slave themes, because this was music created by a people not just for entertainment, but to find something, find them that cohered with the true beauty of the universe and the true concept of freedom. So that these were pieces composed with this idea of a higher purpose for man, which is why you have this unique quality. I mean, you know, there's lots of nice folk music in the West, but folk music is just not, it's not the same as these spirituals, which have a haunting quality of creativity underlying them.
Yeah.
And so we have really focused very much on mobilizing the Black population and the rest of the population around understanding that this was the true American music, as Dvorak recognized, which can, of course, be developed in a classical setting, but that this is the root of what we have to pull together to bring about the freedom of man. Martin Luther King was always addressing this. When he said, the night before he was killed, when he said, I have been to the promised land. I have been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promise. I might not be there with you, but I know for sure our people will get to the promised land. And of course, he meant the Black population, but he didn't mean only the Black population.
That's right.
He knew that it was only by solving that issue that we could bring the nation and the world to a higher plane.
I mean, whenever they play that speech, you can hear it a million times, but every single time it's like he reaches into your soul and just lifts it up. It's just incredible. It's an incredible piece of oratory.
LaRouche often said that Martin Luther King was the only person he knew since Kennedy who had the quality to be the president of the United States.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen videos on YouTube of like a demonstration happening and where the LaRouche movement was involved in it somehow. It wasn't a LaRouche demonstration, but then all of a sudden, and maybe there were hecklers or something, I can't remember exactly, and then all of a sudden the LaRouche people would start singing in chorus, and it would just transform the entire environment. Because when you have the human voice singing in harmony and touching these really metaphysical qualities that that we neglect all around, it just everyone is transfixed. They have to look. They have to stop. They have to rethink. They're pulled out of the lower animal concerns that they might be, and just the sensory perceptions, I suppose, that they're involved in. It's quite incredible to witness.
Absolutely the case. You've probably seen these so-called flash mobs, Beethoven flash mobs, where orchestras around the world have gone into a community and just the big bass starts with and then one or two instruments join them. And they sing the An die Freude, the Ode de Joy, the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. And you just watch the faces of the people in this shopping center or a mall. It transforms them. They're lifted out of their sort of normal, banal existence and experience something that truly lifts the soul. Yeah. Now, if you take that as a political issue and you take that quality that comes out in people through participating in classical music and convey to them that they have the power to change history. They can master economics and science. If they can master music, they can master economics and science, and economics not as a cold mathematical science, but really the science of human progress, right? That this is the way in which you can create a renaissance. And the difficult thing that LaRouche has always insisted on is that you have to acknowledge to yourself that we're not going to win any of these fights. We're not going to stop world war. We're not going to stop world depressions unless we create a renaissance. Yeah. You can't do it piece by piece by piece. We have to have the world come together around a true human renaissance, not a Western or Eastern or African, but a human renaissance, given the principles that we now have in our grasp and the dangers we have in the thermonuclear era, right? We have to create a true renaissance which uplifts the human race, as Helga likes to say, to get mankind out of its childhood where it's throwing mud at each other and squabbling, and become adults working together to reach out to space, to experience the mission of mankind as it can and must be, as it is in fact, although it's capable of failing. This is the nature of man, whether you believe that it was created by God or whatever else you think. This is the nature of man. It's the true scientific nature of man as a creative being. And therefore we have that, each and every individual has to find what Schiller called the sublime within themselves, that which is more important than human life itself. Not that you want to die, as also Martin Luther King said, I don't want to die, I want to live like every other man, but I'm not going to give up on the truth. You have to be willing to face death. And this concept of the internal sublime is the nature of man. We aren't animals. People unfortunately let themselves treat themselves and be treated as animals, but that's not the truth about who we are.
Absolutely. I mean, so that very much, I mean, sounds like, the message that you really want to get out in the world. Is that how you would summarize the main message that you
a good point to close? Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and what's interesting in getting out this message that you've been doing. I mean, over the years, you've seen and you've employed a number of communication technologies, from magazines to the internet. I don't know if you've ever done TV before, but certainly you have a kind of production studio there at your headquarters. I mean, what has been the best way you found out?
We have lots of video, you know that. Right?
Yeah, lots on YouTube and everything. I mean, what have you found to be the best way to get your message out to as many of the right people as possible?
You have to do all of what you just said, but really the best way is to have a class with about 20 or 25 people who are able to interact. If you haven't had a chance to watch the two classes given by Will Wirtz, one on Cusa and one on Schiller in this 6-part series that we just finished, the others are also excellent classes. But I strongly encourage you to watch these two classes. You'll see how in an environment where there's like 20 or 30 people, and the exchange, especially the question and answer period after his presentation on Cusa in the one class and on Schiller in the other, you'll see that there's just an experiencing of a lifting of the spirit and an enhancing of the creative power. Percy Shelley said in his book called In Defense of Poetry, he develops this idea of the poet as the true legislator of history. And he concludes by saying that at moments of breakdown crisis, at revolutionary moments in history, that people suddenly become capable of comprehending profound ideas about man and nature, which in normal circumstances they can't. But you can see that that's the situation we're living in today. And if you see how a classroom with 20, 25 people, and many other people watching on the video, but the interplay in the classroom, and of course this gives you I won't go into it now, but I mean, this gives you a sense of how education can and must be in the future. Exactly. Because it's in those circumstances that you see the interplay of people. And it's the same concept that we have for our community choruses. It's where you are participating with others in a kind of dialogue, be it musical or intellectual, that you begin to experience your true humanity.
Correct. I mean, looking back over your life so far and all the things you've done and your journey, and I mean, is there anything you'd do differently or change over?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, I faced a crisis when I was first told that if I copped the plea, I would get a short sentence or maybe even let go.
Yeah.
And at that point you had to face this question of the sublime. What's really important? Am I going to escape going to prison and be free, or would I be making myself a slave by doing so, by compromising on the truth? And that was a tough decision. Some other people discouraged me from.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure your family, it would have been so tough on your family.
It was very tough on my wife, who had to live with me gone for 10 years.
Yeah.
She did an incredible job of traveling the world and meeting with prime ministers and world courts and so forth, not just on my behalf, but on the injustice and the necessity of LaRouche's ideas being continued despite his being incarcerated. But it was tough on her. She ended up, I believe, getting Alzheimer's because of that tension on her, which was very tough. But it's Joan of Arc was what, 17 or something when she founded the state, but she knew that Schiller has a poem about Joan of Arc which ends, "The pain is brief, the joy is eternal."
Yeah. I mean, you're obviously, an incredibly strong man, from inside out. I mean, what's the most important thing that gave you the strength in taking up and facing these incredible challenges?
This man is a genius.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to go on.
Yeah. I totally understand. Yeah. In closing, for any young people listening, do you have any, they may be inspired by your story. I'm sure they would be. Probably many would be frightened as well. Looking, what would be advice you'd give?
Well, we have created access to LaRouche and his creations and his ideas and the tremendous things that have been produced by those who worked with him and myself. This is available to the human race. There's no reason that every single human being, as long as they have the language capacities, and not just English, but the many languages in which we produce, to give themselves access to these ideas. And when they do, they'll be changed. And I've been reading the thousands of messages that are coming in from our friends around the world with Lynn's death. And almost every one of them points to the fact that they were changed as human beings, that their life became worthwhile because they were inspired by these ideas to reflect on their own creative powers and to start the process of discovering the truth about science and economics and music and culture and philosophy. This is available to everyone, despite the control over the culture and our education system by the British Empire. It's available now, as you mentioned, because we have this internet phenomena. It's there on our website. And
the website is which one? LaRouchePAC.com? Is that where you would send people?
There's LaRouchePAC.com, PAC for Political Action Committee, and LaRouche Pub for publication, which is the website of the EIR magazine.
Right. So if people want to join, get involved, LaRouchePAC.com and LaRouchePub.com. Yeah. I want to thank you, Michael, for
very interesting time, very interesting discussion. Thank you.
And not only for the discussion, but for your life. I mean, for what you've done, for the inspiration you've given, for the strength of your struggle, for your incessant writing and activism and work. I want to thank you as well personally for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, and like and share this podcast with your friends. And make sure to sign the exoneration petition for Lyndon LaRouche. Thanks, and bye for now.